Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning, right? And you are suddenly the CEO of an entire continent.
Oh, wow. Okay, that sounds like a nightmare.
Right. But there is a massive catch. Money hasn't been invented yet.
Right.
There's no concept of a written legal code. There are no human resources departments, no municipal trash collection, and definitely no standing armies.
You are literally starting from absolute zero.
Absolute zero. You are responsible for 50,000 people who have never lived together in one place before. And they truly believe, they really believe this, that if they don't feed a literal wooden statue twice a day, the sun will just stop shining and the rivers will dry up.
Yeah, the pressure is on.
You just have to figure out how to stop everyone from killing each other, how to keep them fed, and basically how to build a civilization from absolute scratch.
It's the ultimate logistical nightmare. Scaling up human interaction from a tiny scattered network of farming villages to a massive, bustling metropolis, it requires a level of organizational genius that we just completely take for granted today.
We really do.
Because when humans are packed tightly together, friction is just inevitable,
Yeah.
To survive, you have to invent the very mechanics of society.
And that is exactly what we are exploring on today's deep dive. We are taking a 1,400-year journey through ancient Mesopotamia.
A huge chunk of time.
Yeah, specifically looking at the era between 2004 BC and 539 BC. And for you listening today, we have pulled together an incredibly rich stack of sources.
We've got historical overviews, detailed analyses from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the World History Encyclopedia, Ancient Origins, and Study.com.
Right. And the mission for you listening is to look at how humanity first engineered the blueprint for living together on a massive scale.
Exactly. We're going to examine the actual machinery of ancient empires, not just, a list of unpronounceable names or dates to memorize, but the specific mechanisms of power.
Because they invented things we still use every day.
Oh, absolutely. We'll look at how these ancients invented mathematical concepts that are currently running on your smartphone, how they engineered the world's first massive bureaucratic systems, the terrifying logistics of ancient psychological warfare.
Which gets pretty dark.
Very dark. And finally, how a very real tension between political kings and religious priests eventually brought down the greatest city on earth.
I think the best place to start any story about building an empire is to look at the wreckage of the one that came before it.
Right, because context is everything.
Exactly. You can't understand how a new power rises until you understand the specific flavor of chaos it emerged from. So let's wind the clock back to roughly 2004 BC.
Okay, setting the scene.
We are in Lower Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq, and the most magnificent civilization on Earth is just burning to the ground.
Yeah, you were talking about the collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur, which historians often refer to as the Sumerian Renaissance.
Because it was this golden age, right?
Okay. It really was. For about a century, the city of Ur was the glittering, undisputed jewel of the world. It was a highly centralized, incredibly prosperous bureaucratic state.
Right.
They had massive agricultural surpluses, monumental architecture, and a deeply complex administrative state. But it suffered this fatal two-front collapse that completely shattered the region.
See, how does an empire that organized and that wealthy just collapse? I always imagine these ancient empires falling because of some massive apocalyptic single event, like, I don't know, a meteor or a volcano.
Like Pompeii or something.
Right. But looking at the sources, this was a slow bleed followed by a sudden decapitation, wasn't it?
That is a very, very accurate way to frame it. The slow bleed came from the west. For decades, you had continuous migrations of a people called the Amorites.
Okay.
They were Semitic-speaking nomadic pastoralists, and they were moving out of the Syrian steppe and into the highly urbanized agricultural zones of southern Mesopotamia.
I'm trying to picture this. Was this like an armed invasion? Were the Amorites showing up with swords and burning villages?
No, not initially. It was a slow demographic shift. Imagine a massive influx of people seeking better land and resources.
Just looking for a better life.
Right. They're moving their flocks into agricultural territories, which creates intense friction with the settled Sumerian farmers. The central government in Ur actually tried to build a massive 170-mile-long wall to keep the Amorites out.
A 170-mile wall?
Yeah, known as the Repeller of the Amorites.
Wow, catchy name.
Right. But walls are only as good as the soldiers guarding them, and Ur was stretching its resources incredibly thin, trying to man this thing.
So the Amorites are straining the system from the west, the economy is buckling under the pressure of this massive migration, and then the killing blow comes from the opposite direction.
Precisely. While Ur is desperately trying to manage the Amorite migration and the resulting internal destabilization, the Elamites, who lived in what is now southwestern Iran, see an opportunity.
They see weakness.
Exactly. They launch a massive, coordinated military invasion from the east. They sweep across the plains, they breach the walls of Ur, and completely sack the city.
Just total
They
devastation.
destroy the temples, they loot the treasuries, and in a move that completely shattered the Sumerian psyche, they physically capture the last king of Ur.
A guy named Ibbi-Sin, right?
Yes, Ibbi-Sin. They put him in chains, and they drag him away into captivity in Elam.
The psychological shock of that is hard to even comprehend. Because to the people living there, Ur wasn't just a capital city, it was the center of the universe.
Sanctioned by the gods themselves.
Right. So to see your divinely appointed king physically dragged away in chains, it must have felt like the literal end of the world.
Oh, the historical record shows exactly how devastating it was. The literature from the period is dominated by a genre known as city laments.
Like sad poetry.
Basically.
Yeah.
We have the lament for Sumer and Ur, where poets describe the gods literally abandoning their temples like fleeing birds, while corpses just pile up in the streets.
Wow.
The theological implications were horrifying to them. It wasn't just that they lost a war, it meant the cosmic order had been fundamentally broken.
And when the cosmic order breaks, you get a massive power vacuum. The empire shatters into a dozen different pieces, which the sources call the Isen-Larsa period.
Right.
Basically, Lower Mesopotamia turns into a squabbling mess of competing city-states.
Yes. The city of Isen initially tries to step into the void left by Ur. The rulers of Isen desperately tried to claim the prestigious mantle of the fallen empire, using the same royal titles and, patronizing the same temples.
Trying to pretend everything is fine.
Exactly. Trying to project this illusion that the empire hadn't fallen, it merely relocated its headquarters. But over time, the rival city of Larsa, which is located further south, gains the economic and military upper hand.
So they just fight it out.
Yeah, the two cities grind each other down in endless, exhausting territorial disputes.
But here is what I find fascinating. While Isen and Larsa are distracted, fighting this exhausted civil war over the scraps of the old empire, those Amorite nomads we talked about earlier, they are quietly evolving.
Yeah, they are.
They aren't just wandering the steppes with their sheep anymore.
No, they are settling down. The Amorites were incredibly adaptable. Over a few generations, they assimilated into the local Mesopotamian culture. They learned the Akkadian language. They adopted the local administrative practices.
You could just blend it right in.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
And their leaders began establishing their own dynasties in various city-states across the region. And one of those city-states was a small, relatively obscure town on the Euphrates River called Babylon.
See, if you were placing bets on which city would conquer the world in 1900 BC, you would never put your money on Babylon.
Not a chance.
It was a total backwater compared to the ancient prestige of Ur or Uruk.
It was entirely insignificant. But the Amorite dynasty that takes control of Babylon is incredibly patient.
Playing the long game.
Very much so. They spend the first few generations quietly building up their infrastructure, digging canals, and securing their immediate borders. They wait for the larger powers to exhaust themselves.
Right.
Which brings us to the sixth ruler of this first dynasty of Babylon, a man who ascended the throne around 1792 BC. His name is Hammurabi.
Okay, stop right there, because everyone listening knows that name.
Oh, absolutely.
When you hear Hammurabi, you immediately think of the law code, the giant stone pillar in the Lu, an eye for an eye. We picture him as this stern judge sitting in a courtroom.
Right, the ultimate lawgiver.
But digging into these sources, that image is totally incomplete. Hammurabi was basically a ruthless modern tech startup founder who aggressively acquired, dismantled, and absorbed every single one of his competitors to create a total monopoly.
That analogy fits his military and diplomatic strategy perfectly. I mean, Hammurabi was not just a lawmaker. He was one of the most brilliant, cunning, and honestly deceptive military strategists in ancient history.
Because he started small, right?
Very small. When he took the throne, Babylon was a mid-sized power surrounded by giants, Larsa to the south, Eshnunna to the east, Mari to the northwest, and the powerful kingdom of Assyria to the north.
So if he just tried to fight them, he'd lose.
Instantly. If he had just marched out with his army, he would have been crushed.
So how does a mid-sized player take over the entire board? The sources talk about his shifting alliances, but how did that actually work in practice?
It was diplomatic brilliance bordering on sociopathy.
Wow.
Yeah. Hammurabi would constantly form coalitions to gang up on a mutual enemy. For example, he allied with the powerful city-state of Mari and the kingdom of Elam to attack Eshnunna.
Okay, a 3-on-1 fight.
Exactly. They combined their forces, besieged the cities, and completely destroyed Eshnunna's power base. But the moment the war was over, the alliance dissolved. Hammurabi then turned around and allied with Mari to attack his former ally, Elam.
Wait, he used his allies as a blunt instrument, let them take the heavy casualties in the fighting, and then once they were exhausted from winning his war for him, he turned around and conquered them too.
That is exactly what he did, and the most famous example of this is his relationship with the city of Larsa. For years, Hammurabi had an alliance with King Rimsin of Larsa.
Best buds.
Right. But once Hammurabi had secured his other borders, he turned on Rimsin, besieged Larsa, and took control of the entire wealthy southern region of Sumer.
Incredible.
And then finally, he turned his sights on his longest-standing ally, King Zimri-Lim of Mari. Zimri-Lim had trusted Hammurabi for years, supplying him with troops. Hammurabi marched into Mari, sacked the city, and burned Zimri-Lim's magnificent palace to the ground.
It is breathtakingly cold-blooded.
It really is.
And through this aggressive, systematic betrayal and conquest, he unifies the entire region of Sumer and Akkad into a single, massive political entity. This is the first time in history we can accurately call this region Babylonia. He is the undisputed, absolute ruler of Mesopotamia.
And he didn't just conquer it, he micromanaged it to an almost absurd degree. The archaeological record is full of letters Hammurabi dictated to his scribes, sending very specific orders to regional governors.
I read about this. The guy conquers half the known world, and yet we have letters of him personally deciding the outcome of petty disputes over irrigation ditches. Why is the emperor of the world acting like a local claims adjuster?
Because that was the very nature of his power. Centralized empires in this era were built almost entirely on the individual charisma, energy, and genius of a single ruler.
So he couldn't delegate.
He felt he couldn't. Hammurabi felt he had to personally ensure the entire machinery of the state was functioning because he just didn't trust a decentralized bureaucracy to do it for him.
Right.
He oversaw canal clearing, calendar intercalation, meaning he personally decided when to add a leap month to the year, and the redistribution of land to his soldiers.
But that level of centralization seems incredibly fragile. I mean, if the entire system relies on the hyper-competence of one guy who works 20 hours a day,
Yeah.
what happens when that guy dies?
Well, the system immediately begins to buckle. And this is a recurring theme in Mesopotamian history. When you centralize power that heavily into one charismatic figure, the empire hums beautifully while they are alive. But the moment they die, the massive bureaucratic machine struggles to function under lesser successors, who just don't have the same political instincts or military terror keeping the governors in line.
So the successors just couldn't keep the plate spinning. The sources indicate that after Hammurabi's death in 1750 BC, the Babylonian Empire slowly started bleeding territory over the next century and a half.
Yes, it was a slow decline.
Regional rebellions break out, the extreme south breaks away entirely, and the economy stagnates, which sets the stage for a sudden, shocking end to the first dynasty of Babylon in 1595 BC.
Yes, and the killing blow doesn't actually come from a local rival. It comes out of nowhere from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. King Mursili I of the Hittite Empire launches an audacious lightning-fast raid hundreds of miles down the Euphrates River.
But wait, Anatolia is incredibly far away, especially for a Bronze Age army marching on foot and in chariots. Why would the Hittites march that far? Did they want to rule Babylon?
No, and that is what makes it so devastating. Mursili had absolutely no logistical capacity to occupy and govern Babylonia. It was purely a raid for loot and international glory.
Just a hit and run.
Exactly. The Hittites smashed through the weakened Babylonian defenses, breached the city walls, and engaged in a massive smash-and-grab operation. They looted the royal treasuries, and crucially, they stole the sacred statues of Babylon's patron gods, including Marduk, and hauled them back to Anatolia.
There goes the cosmic order again.
Right. The Hittites marched right back home, leaving a burning, traumatized city in their wake. But that single violent shock was enough to completely shatter the fragile political structure the Amorites had built. The first dynasty of Babylon was wiped off the map in a matter of days.
Okay, so Babylon has been sacked, the Hittites have gone home with their loot, and a massive power vacuum opens up again. We are entering a new era now, roughly spanning from 1595 to 612 BC.
A very turbulent era.
And looking at the sources, what fascinates me here is the massive, almost unbelievable contrast in how different empires chose to rule their territories. We are basically looking at an ancient laboratory testing two wildly different management styles. One in
Yes.
the south, down in Babylonia, and one in the north, up in Assyria. Let's start with the south. Who walks into the smoking ruins of Babylon after the Hittites leave?
A group called the Kassites. Their origins are somewhat murky, but they were a non-Semitic people who likely originated from the Zagros Mountains to the east of Mesopotamia.
Okay.
They had been interacting with Babylonia as mercenaries and agricultural laborers for decades. When the Amorite dynasty collapses, the Kassites move into the power vacuum and do something truly remarkable. They managed to unify Babylonia and hold it together under a single dynasty for over 400 years.
400 years. Hammurabi's successors couldn't even hold it together for a century and a half.
Right.
How did the Kassites pull off that kind of extreme longevity?
Through a strategy of near-total cultural assimilation. Yeah. The Kassites were brilliant at recognizing the inherent value of the Mesopotamian software. The religion, the administrative systems, the literature. They didn't come in and try to force Kassite language or mountain gods onto the Babylonians.
So they essentially executed a friendly corporate takeover and decided to keep the existing brand identity because it was already successful.
That is a very apt comparison. The Kassites adopted the Akkadian language for all their official records. They poured immense resources into rebuilding the ancient Sumerian and Babylonian temples that had fallen into disrepair.
Fixing up the infrastructure.
Exactly. And they returned the stolen statues of the gods to their rightful places once they negotiated for them. To the average Babylonian farmer or priest, the Kassites essentially said, "We are the new political management, but we revere your culture, we worship your gods, and our goal is stability and economic growth."
And it worked. The sources call this period the Amarna Age, which is famous for its intense international diplomacy. The Kassite kings weren't focused on bloody conquests. They were writing letters to the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of the Hittite Empire, arranging high-level trade deals and diplomatic marriages.
Yes, the Amarna letters give us a fascinating window into this era. The kings address each other as brother.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. They argue over the exact weight of gold shipments and arrange for their daughters to marry into each other's courts to cement alliances. It was a period of cosmopolitan international balance of power. The Kassites provided incredible stability through integration.
It sounds so rational. Build trade routes, marry off your daughters to secure peace, sponsor the local arts, and just keep the economy booming.
It was very rational.
But then we look up north. While the Kassites are holding down the south with diplomacy, what on earth is happening in northern Mesopotamia with the Assyrians?
The north is a violently different story. To understand Assyria, you have to understand their geography. Unlike Babylon, which was relatively protected by deserts and marshes, Assyria was located in northern Mesopotamia, surrounded by rugged mountains and hostile neighbors on almost all sides. They had no natural borders.
So they were vulnerable.
Extremely. For centuries, their survival depended on being highly militarized, just to avoid being wiped out.
Paranoia as a national defense strategy.
Exactly. Following the Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious period around 1200 BC where multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East simultaneously collapsed due to famine, invasions, and systemic failure. Assyria experiences a temporary decline,
Sure.
but they weather the storm better than most. And starting around 911 BC, they bounce back with a terrifying vengeance, initiating the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
And this becomes the largest territorial empire the world had ever seen up to that point.
Yeah.
But reading the sources, they did not achieve this through the Kassite strategy of assimilation and trade.
No, absolutely not.
The Neo-Assyrian Empire feels like the Galactic Empire in Star Wars. They ruled entirely through a combination of cutting-edge military technology and absolute, unadulterated psychological terror.
The technological leap is crucial here. The Assyrians were pioneers in the large-scale, systemic use of iron weaponry.
Hold on, I want to dig into that. We always hear about the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. But why does iron suddenly give the Assyrians such a massive advantage? Bronze weapons are still sharp and deadly. Why is iron the ultimate game changer?
It comes down to logistics and metallurgy. Bronze is an alloy, primarily made of copper and tin.
Okay.
Copper is relatively common, but tin is incredibly rare. To make bronze, ancient empires had to maintain long, fragile international trade routes. I mean, tin often came all the way from modern-day Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus.
That's a huge supply chain.
Huge. When the Bronze Age collapsed, Those trade routes were severed.
So you literally couldn't source the ingredients to make weapons.
Exactly. But iron ore is abundant. It is found everywhere in the Earth's crust. The problem is that smelting iron requires a much higher temperature than copper. And early iron is brittle unless it absorbs carbon to become a rudimentary steel.
So it's harder to make?
It is, but the Assyrians mastered the blast furnace technology required to forge reliable iron weapons. Because the raw material was everywhere, they didn't have to rely on fragile international trade.
They had it all locally.
Right. They could mass-produce iron swords, spears, and armor on an industrial scale. Iron democratized warfare for them. It allowed them to equip a massively expanded army much cheaper than outfitting them in bronze.
So they have cheaper, stronger weapons, and they completely restructure their military to use them. The sources say they created the world's first true, highly organized standing army.
Yes. Prior to this, most armies were seasonal militias. You drafted farmers after the harvest, fought a war for a few months, and sent them home to plant the next crop.
Which limits how long you can fight.
Exactly. But the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III reformed this entirely. He created a professional, year-round, salaried military machine. It was a combined arms force, specialized units of charioteers, heavy cavalry, light archers, and most terrifyingly dedicated siege engineers.
Siege engineers, like they had units dedicated solely to breaking into cities.
Entire corps dedicated to building siege towers, battering rams, and sapping walls. Before the Assyrians, if a city closed its massive gates, an army basically had to sit outside and try to starve them out, which could take years.
Just wait them out.
Right. The Assyrians developed the technology to physically tear the walls down. No city was safe.
But it's not just the technology that makes them terrifying, it's the psychological warfare. The royal inscriptions left behind by Assyrian kings like Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, it's genuinely horrifying reading.
They wanted it to be horrifying. The Assyrians practiced calculated terrorism as state policy. If a city rebelled against Assyrian rule, the army wouldn't just defeat them in battle. They would make a grotesque theatrical example of them to ensure no one else dared to rebel.
What kind of example?
The inscriptions boast about flaying rebel leaders alive and draping their skins over the city walls. They would impale captives on stakes outside the gates, cut off hands, noses, and ears, and leave pyramids of skulls.
It's hard to even process that level of cruelty. It's just so evil.
It was calculated cruelty.
But the sources also focus heavily on another tactic they used, which seems less gory, but perhaps even more structurally devastating to a conquered people. Mass deportations.
Yes, forced population transfers. If a region proved chronically rebellious, the Assyrians wouldn't just kill the leadership, they would systematically uproot the entire surviving population.
Just pack everyone up.
Yes. We were talking about tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. They would pack them up and march them hundreds of miles away to the opposite end of the empire, resettling them among strangers.
I was trying to find a way to conceptualize that, and the best analogy I could think of is shuffling a deck of cards.
Oh, that's good.
Right. If you have a rebellious city, they all speak the same language, they have the same local gods, they have a shared history, they are all the spades in the deck. But if you take those spades, break them up, and shuffle them into cities full of hearts, clubs, and diamonds, they can never organize a coordinated strike again. You strip away their shared identity.
That is a brilliant analogy. It completely shattered local resistance networks. You cannot mount a cohesive rebellion when you are a stranger in a strange land, surrounded by other deported peoples who speak completely different languages and worship different gods.
It breaks the spirit of the people.
It does. But the deportations served a dual logistical purpose. It wasn't just about breaking resistance. It was a massive labor redistribution scheme.
Moving the human capital to where the state needed it most.
Exactly. The Assyrian kings were building these grand, intimidating, monumental capitals from scratch, cities like Nimrud, Dur-Sharrukin, and Nineveh. They needed skilled artisans, engineers, and thousands of agricultural workers to feed the new capitals. The Assyrian state treated human beings as a fungible resource to be deployed wherever the imperial machine required them.
But history shows us time and time again that if fear and sheer brutality are your only management tools, you are running a massive risk. Your subjects aren't loyal, they're just waiting for you to blink. And that is exactly what happened to Assyria, isn't it?
The contrast with the Kassites is striking here. The Kassite approach of assimilation and respect bought them 4 centuries of stability. The Assyrian approach of total domination and terror created an empire that stretched all the way from western Iran to the borders of Egypt. but it sowed the deeply entrenched seeds of its own violent destruction.
Because everyone hated them.
The extreme brutality generated a generational simmering hatred among every single subject people.
So how does the Death Star explode?
It happens remarkably fast. The Assyrian Central Authority experiences a period of dynastic instability and civil war in the late 7th century BC.
So they start fighting themselves.
Exactly. And the moment the imperial core shows weakness and the armies are distracted fighting each other, the subjugated peoples realize this is their only chance. A massive, unprecedented coalition forms. The Medes, a powerful tribal confederacy marching from the Zagros Mountains in the east, join forces with the Babylonians in the south, who had never stopped hating their Assyrian overlords.
The ultimate revenge alliance.
In 612 BC, this combined army marches on the magnificent, heavily fortified Assyrian capital of Nineveh. After a brutal siege, they breach the walls, sack the city, and burn it to the ground.
Wow. Just completely destroyed it?
They don't just conquer Assyria, they completely, vengefully annihilate the Assyrian state. The infrastructure is dismantled, the elite are killed or scattered, and the empire that terrorized the Near East for 3 centuries vanishes almost overnight.
Okay, let's take a breath and look at what we've just covered. We have centuries of constant, brutal warfare. The Amorites take over, the Hittites smash Babylon, the Kassites settle down and assimilate, the Assyrians rise up and conquer everyone with iron and psychological terror, and then the Assyrians get utterly annihilated by a coalition.
It is a lot of turnover.
It is. With empires constantly being overthrown, capitals burning, and populations being shuffled around like a deck of cards, you would think the fundamental society would just degrade into absolute apocalyptic chaos. But it doesn't.
And that is the miracle of Mesopotamian history.
Despite the constant overthrow of the hardware, the kings, the dynasties, the armies, the underlying software of the society somehow survived and evolved. I want to shift gears and look at this cultural continuity because it explains why this region remained the center of the world for so long.
I love that framing the software of civilization, because the people of Mesopotamia, stretching back to the Sumerians, developed cultural systems, language, law, bureaucracy, and religion that were so robust, so complex, and so inherently useful for organizing human beings that every single conquering group eventually realized it was easier to adopt those systems than to try and replace them.
Let's start with the operating system itself.
Right.
Language. I found it utterly fascinating reading the sources for you that the original language of the region, Sumerian, died out entirely as a spoken everyday language right around the time Earl III collapsed in 2004 BC. Nobody spoke it at home or in the markets.
That's correct. As a living spoken tongue, Sumerian goes extinct early in our timeline. The Akkadian language, which is a Semitic language used by the Amorites, Babylonians, and Assyrians, completely takes over as the vernacular.
Okay.
Akkadian eventually branches into distinct Babylonian and Assyrian dialects. But here is the crucial part. They did not throw Sumerian away.
No, they treated it almost exactly like Latin in medieval Europe, right?
Yeah.
It became this elite, gate-kept language.
A perfect parallel. Sumerian was preserved for millennia as the sacred classical language of high scholarship, liturgy, and legal precedent. To be a truly educated scribe in Babylon or Nineveh centuries later, you had to master this dead language.
Just to prove you were educated.
Right. You had to memorize the ancient Sumerian cuneiform signs to read the oldest religious texts and understand the foundational myths of your culture.
But the linguistic software keeps updating. Because much later in the timeline, especially during the Neo-Assyrian period, we see another massive shift. Aramaic emerges as the dominant spoken language and the administrative lingua franca across the whole region. But Aramaic wasn't written in cuneiform.
No, Aramaic was written using a much simpler linear alphabetic script, usually written with ink on papyrus or animal parchment. This is vastly different from Akkadian and Sumerian, which used hundreds of complex wedge-shaped cuneiform signs pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus.
Right, because an alphabet has, 20 or 30 letters?
Exactly. An alphabet is much easier to learn than a syllabic cuneiform system.
But even as everyone started speaking Aramaic and writing on papyrus for quick notes, the sources emphasized that cuneiform on clay tablets remained the absolute gold standard for official, legal, and scholarly records right up until the end. Why stick with the difficult, clunky clay tablets when you have parchment?
Because of permanence. Papyrus and parchment rot. They burn, they disintegrate in the damp, they're eaten by insects. Clay is eternal. When a clay tablet dries, and especially if it is baked in an oven, it turns to stone. In a volatile world where cities were constantly being sacked, the Mesopotamians knew that clay was the only way to ensure a contract or a story survived the century.
And it was on those permanent clay tablets that they preserved some of the most profound literature in human history. The scribes working during the Kassite and Assyrian periods weren't just accountants tallying grain, they were scholars collecting, editing, and standardizing major works of theology and human imagination.
Yes. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains the famous story of the Great Flood that predates the biblical account, had existed in various fragmented Sumerian poems for centuries. But it was during the later Babylonian period that a master scribe named Sinlaku-Nini compiled, edited, and standardized it into the definitive 12-tablet standard Babylonian version that we read today.
So they were curating their own cultural legacy.
Exactly. They also codify the Enuma Elish, the epic creation story, and philosophical texts like the Ludlul Bel Nomiki.
The little what?
Ludlul Bel Nemekiti. That last one is often referred to as the Babylonian Job because it explores a man who has done everything right, worshipped the gods perfectly, and yet suffers inexplicable tragedy and disease.
Oh, like the biblical book of Job.
Yes, exactly. He questions why the gods allow the righteous to suffer. It is incredibly deep existential philosophy preserved on mud.
And nowhere is this sheer dedication to preservation more evident than with a king we mentioned earlier for his terror tactics, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal.
Oh, he's a fascinating character.
He really is. This guy is a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, he's flaying rebels alive. On the other, he is the ancient world's most obsessive librarian.
Ashurbanipal was highly unusual for a king because he was trained as a scholar before he took the throne. He boasted in his inscriptions that he could read the complex, ancient Sumerian texts, and that he could decipher the stone inscriptions from before the flood.
Very humble guy.
Oh, very. In the 7th century BC, he established a monumental royal library at his capital in Nineveh.
And he didn't just buy a few books. The sources say he literally dispatched armed agents and scribes throughout the entire conquered expanse of Babylonia and Assyria with royal warrants to collect, confiscate, or copy every known clay tablet of value.
He wanted everything.
Everything. He wanted all the literature, all the historical chronicles, all the medical diagnoses, and all the magical incantations housed in his palace.
It was an attempt to hoard the intellectual capital of the universe. He amassed tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. And honestly, modern historians owe an unpayable debt to Ashurbanipal's megalomania. Because in 612 BC, when that coalition we talked about breached the walls of Nineveh and set the royal palaces on fire to destroy the Assyrian legacy.
The fire baked the clay tablets?
Exactly.
It's the greatest irony in archaeological history. The fire meant to wipe the Assyrians from the face of the earth ended up acting as a giant kiln, hardening the tablets and perfectly preserving Ashurbanipal's library for archaeologists to dig up 2.5 millennia later.
The fire that destroyed their empire ensured their software survived forever.
That is just wild. Now, alongside literature, the other crucial piece of societal software they developed was the legal and bureaucratic system. Let's circle back to Hammurabi's code because it is the most famous example of Mesopotamian law.
Right, the code everyone learns in school.
Exactly. Everyone knows the phrase lex talionis, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. On the surface, that sounds incredibly fair. It sounds like true, egalitarian, retributive justice. No matter who you are, the punishment perfectly matches the crime.
It certainly has that reputation in popular culture.
Yeah.
But if we dig into the actual translation of the stela, we see a very different reality.
Exactly. I want to push back on this concept of Hammurabi's justice because when I read the breakdown of the laws, it is rigidly, unapologetically class-based. How did that tiered system actually work in practice?
Well, society under Hammurabi was explicitly divided into 3 legal tiers. At the top, you have the free elites, called the Awilu. These are the property owners, the high-ranking soldiers, the priests.
Upper class.
Right. In the middle, you have the commoners, called the Muskanu free people, but of lower social and economic standing. And at the bottom, you have the slaves, the Wardu.
So how does an eye for an eye apply across those tiers?
It only applies if you are in the same tier. If an Awilu, an elite, knocks out the eye of another elite Awilu, then yes, the punishment is literal. His own eye is knocked out, an eye for an eye.
But what if that elite Oilu knocks out the eye of a commoner, Muskenu?
Then the physical punishment vanishes.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The elite simply pays a monetary fine 1 mina of silver. And if the elite knocks out the eye of a slave, he pays half the slave's market value to the slave's owner.
So my eye is literally worth more than yours if I have a higher social standing. That completely shatters the illusion of equality. It's less about universal justice and more about the state strictly enforcing a rigid social hierarchy.
You have to understand how the Mesopotamian mind viewed the universe. To them, justice did not mean equality. Equality was an absurd concept. Justice meant maintaining the divinely ordained order of the universe, and the gods intended for there to be elites, commoners, and slaves. The law code was a tool designed to prevent society from descending into chaotic blood feuds by explicitly defining the exact monetary or physical cost of any transgression based on who you were.
And they applied this rigid, obsessive need to categorize and track everything to their daily bureaucracy. Reading about their economy, it sounds exhausting. Basically, every single human interaction had to be logged.
Yes, it was an immensely bureaucratic society. If you were adopting a child, getting married, taking out a loan for seed grain, or resolving a dispute over a runaway slave, you had to have a scribe write it down on a clay tablet.
And sign it, right?
Yeah, and it had to be sealed by witnesses pressing their unique cylinder seals into the wet clay.
hmm
You couldn't buy a cow without a paper trail, or rather a clay trail.
And for massive transactions, they took this documentation to an extreme level. The sources talk about something introduced during the Kassite period called kuduras. What exactly is a kuduru, and why were they so terrifying?
A kuduru is a massive stone boundary monument. When the king gave a large royal land grant to a loyal official or a temple, a simple clay tablet wasn't sufficient to prove ownership. They carved the legal details of the land grant onto a large boulder and placed it on the property.
But it wasn't just a deed to the land, it was covered in threats.
Elaborate, terrifying divine threats. The kuduru was heavily carved with the symbols of the major gods, the sun disk of Shamash, the crescent moon of Sin, the spade of Marduk, and the text at the bottom would contain horrific curses directed at anyone who tried to dispute the claim or move the stone.
The sources translate some of these, and they are wild. The contract would literally say, if any official or neighbor tries to claim this field or throws this stone in the river or hides it in the dirt, may the god Anu strike them down with disease. May the goddess Ishtar strip them of their weapons in battle. May their family line be erased from the earth and their ghost find no water in the underworld.
So the legal contract was backed by the ultimate threat of divine wrath. And this bureaucratic obsession, the written laws, the daily receipts, the boundary stones, that was the true glue of the empire.
It's what kept everything running.
Exactly. When a conqueror like the Kansasites or even the Persians later came in, they couldn't sweep this system away. They had to adopt the cuneiform, the scribes, and the clay tablets just to collect taxes and keep the farms running. The conquerors were conquered by the bureaucracy.
So we've seen how this obsessive need to organize society through written laws and lists completely dominated their human interactions. But what blew my mind in these sources is that they applied this exact same need to quantify and categorize to the physical and celestial worlds. Let's explore how the Mesopotamians deciphered the cosmos, starting with their mathematics.
This is where their legacy most directly impacts our modern daily lives. The Babylonians used a sexagesimal numerical system.
Meaning base 60. Today, we use a base 10 decimal system, which feels completely natural because we have 10 fingers. Choosing base 60 seems totally arbitrary and, frankly, overly complicated. Why on earth would an ancient civilization choose 60 as their mathematical foundation?
It seems counterintuitive to us, but base 60 is actually a mathematical marvel, especially if you're doing complex calculations without a calculator. Think about the number 10. It is only evenly divisible by 1, 2, 5, and 10. If you try to divide 10 by 3 or 4, you get messy fractions.
Right, you get repeating decimals like 3.333.
But look at the number 60. It's a highly composite number. It is evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That makes fractional arithmetic incredibly clean. If you are an ancient merchant trying to divide a massive shipment of grain among 3, 4, or 5 different temples, base 60 means you almost never have to deal with messy fractions.
Precisely. It allowed Babylonian mathematicians and scribes to perform incredibly complex operations with relative ease. We have clay tablets showing them calculating square roots, solving quadratic equations, and doing advanced geometry involving right triangles centuries before the Greek mathematician Pythagoras was even born.
I want to make sure everyone listening right now understands just how deeply embedded this ancient software still is. Every single time you glance at a clock and see that 60 seconds make a minute or 60 minutes make an hour, you are using Babylonian math. Every time a modern engineer calculates the 360 degrees of a circle, they are using the sexagesimal system invented in ancient Mesopotamia. They literally mapped out the geometry of time and space that we still use today.
It's incredible, and their advanced mathematics was deeply, intrinsically intertwined with their astronomy. But we have to be very careful here not to project modern motivations onto them. The Babylonians were not tracking the stars for the sake of abstract scientific discovery, the way an astrophysicist today might.
Right, they weren't building telescopes just to see what was out there. Their astronomy was entirely driven by astrology, wasn't it?
Yes, they held a deep, foundational religious belief that the heavens were a giant illuminated billboard where the gods wrote out their intentions for the earth.
Like divine skywriting.
Exactly. The movements of the planets, the appearance of comets, the eclipses of the sun and moon, these were all divine omens. If you could read the stars, you could predict what the gods were planning to do to the king, the crops, or the empire.
So because the stakes were literally life and death for the empire, they had a state-funded mandate to track the sky perfectly. The sources describe how they kept meticulous, multi-generational records of celestial bodies. They mapped the constellations and obsessively tracked the paths of the planets. They paid special attention to Venus, which was associated with the powerful goddess Ishtar.
And over centuries of relentless data collection on these clay tablets, they amassed a dataset so vast that they began to recognize the mathematical patterns in the celestial movements. By the late Babylonian period, they didn't just have to observe an eclipse. They developed the mathematical algorithms required to accurately predict solar and lunar eclipses years in advance.
Which gave the king an incredible political advantage. If the astrologers tell the king an eclipse is coming, he can perform the necessary rituals to ward off the bad omen before it even happens.
Exactly. This evolution from religious, omen-seeking stargazing into hard mathematical astronomy eventually resulted in the creation of the zodiac, dividing the ecliptic into 12 equal zones that we still recognize today. It's a perfect example of how intense religious devotion can unintentionally birth rigorous empirical science.
And we see this exact same duality, religion and science, holding hands in their medical system. The sources detail the medical practices in Mesopotamia, and it is utterly fascinating. If you lived in Babylon and got sick, there were two very distinct types of doctors you could go see, the Asipu and the Asu. How did that work?
The Asipu was essentially a spiritual healer, an exorcist. In the Mesopotamian worldview, disease was often caused by spiritual imbalance. Perhaps you had angered a specific god by breaking a taboo, or a malicious demon had attached itself to you. The Asipu's job was to diagnose the spiritual root cause and treat you with incantations, prayers, magic rituals, and amulets.
Okay, so that's the faith healer. But what about the Asu?
The Asu was an empirical physician. They were essentially early pharmacists and surgeons. They looked at your physical symptoms, a rash, a broken bone, a fever, and they treated you with practical remedies. They compounded herbal medicines, applied poultices, cleaned wounds, and even performed early forms of surgery, which we know because Hammurabi's code explicitly lays out the malpractice penalties if a surgeon kills a patient with a bronze scalpel.
What I love about this is that reading the sources, these two practitioners were not in competition. It wasn't science fighting against religion.
Not at all. They were entirely complementary.
It's like going to a massive modern hospital where your general practitioner, the ASU, treats your physical infection with antibiotics and bandages, and then they send you down the hall to the in-house exorcist, the Asipu, who treats your spiritual vibes to make sure the demon of infection doesn't come back. They didn't see science and religion as opposites. They were just two sides of the exact same coin. The physical world and the spiritual world were completely unified.
That unified worldview applied to their engineering and technology as well. Beyond medicine and astronomy, they were pulling off massive technological feats. They pioneered advanced glass-making techniques, creating beautiful, colored glass vessels. We already discussed the complex metallurgy required to transition an entire society's military from bronze to iron. And perhaps most importantly, they engineered massive, state-funded irrigation systems.
Right, because Lower Mesopotamia is essentially an arid floodplain. It doesn't rain enough to support agriculture naturally.
Exactly. Left to nature, it is a harsh, sun-baked landscape. The rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are volatile and flood unpredictably. The Mesopotamians engineered massive networks of canals, levees, and reservoirs to tame the rivers and direct the water perfectly. They transformed a dead floodplain into one of the most incredibly productive agricultural zones in the ancient world, capable of feeding tens of thousands of urban residents.
But again, if you asked a Babylonian engineer how they managed to calculate the slope of that perfect irrigation canal, they wouldn't just hand you the base 60 mathematical formula. They would say they built it using the formula granted to them by the wisdom of Enki, the god of fresh waters.
Because every scientific advancement, every mathematical formula, and every military victory was ultimately attributed to the will of the gods. We simply cannot understand the mechanics of Mesopotamian civilization without understanding who these gods were and how political leaders manipulated them to justify their power.
Which brings us perfectly into the realm of the divine. We need to look at the Mesopotamian pantheon, and more importantly, how earthly kings weaponized theology to justify their own absolute rule. So the Mesopotamians were polytheistic. They worshipped thousands of gods, but the major players were often grouped into specific triads. Let's break down the cosmic hierarchy.
The religious landscape was dominated by two main triads. First, you have the ancient cosmic triad, representing the fundamental elements of the universe. This consisted of Anu, the distant supreme sky god, Enlil, the god of wind, storms, and agriculture, who for a long time was considered the active king of the gods who granted kingship to humans, and Enki, also known as Ea in Akkadian, who was the brilliant god of wisdom, magic, and the life-giving subterranean fresh waters.
Given how volatile the weather and the rivers were in that region, it makes perfect sense that the gods of storms and fresh water were top tier.
Exactly. Their theology reflected their environmental anxieties. Then you have the astral triad, representing the heavens. Sin, the moon god, who was associated with the passage of time. Shamash, the sun god who sees all things and therefore is the ultimate judge of truth and justice. Remember, it was Shamash who handed the law code down to Hammurabi.
Right, I remember that.
And finally, Ishtar, arguably the most complex deity in the pantheon. She was the fiercely powerful goddess of love, fertility, and brutal, chaotic warfare.
But the hierarchy of these gods wasn't static, was it? Just like the empires on Earth were constantly shifting and overthrowing each other, the heavens were constantly shifting. And this introduces a concept the sources repeatedly focus on called state theology. Basically, how political shifts on Earth forced a change in the heavenly hierarchy. How did state theology actually work?
State theology is perhaps the single most important concept for understanding ancient Mesopotamian politics. In their worldview, when a city conquered its neighbors, it didn't just mean their army had better iron swords or better tactics. It fundamentally meant that their local patron god had defeated the neighbor's gods in the spiritual realm.
Okay, so let's look at Babylon. When we talked about Hammurabi earlier, Babylon started as this obscure, tiny town. Its local patron god was a relatively minor deity named Marduk. But as Babylon conquers the entire region and becomes a massive empire, it creates a theological problem, right? You can't have the king of the universe worshiping a third-tier god.
Precisely. If Babylon is the supreme city, Marduk must be the supreme god. So the Babylonian scribes and priests literally rewrote the mythology to justify this political reality. They codified this in the epic creation story, the Enuma Elish.
How does the story elevate him?
The text describes a massive, terrifying war in heaven before the earth was created. The older gods are paralyzed by a primordial chaos dragon named Tiamat, who represents the destructive, untamed saltwater ocean. None of the ancient powerful gods like Anu or Enki have the courage to fight her. Then young Marduk steps up. He tells the assembly of the gods, "I will kill the dragon and save you all, but only on one condition. You must make me the absolute, undisputed, supreme king of the gods."
A divine hostage negotiation.
Essentially, yes. The gods agree. Marduk kills Tiamat in an epic battle, splits her massive body in half to create the heavens and the earth, and takes the throne. Marduk is now often simply referred to as Beel, which translates to Lord. The Enuma Elish is a brilliant piece of theological propaganda. It explains to everyone in the empire what Babylon gets to rule, because their God saved the universe.
And we see the exact same manipulation of state theology happen up north with the Assyrians, right? But their supreme god was named Ashur.
Yes. Ashur was the patron god of Assyria's original capital city, also named Ashur. But unlike Marduk, who got this elaborate dramatic backstory of fighting a chaos dragon, Ashur didn't have much independent mythology of his own. Instead, as the Assyrian Empire expanded, their theologians just aggressively copy-pasted.
What do you mean they copy-pasted?
They systematically absorbed the characteristics and myths of other major gods, particularly Enlil and Marduk, and assigned them to Ashur. They even rewrote versions of the Enuma Elish, where Ashur is the one who kills Tiamat, not Marduk. The Assyrians made Ashur the supreme national deity, and they explicitly viewed their violent imperial expansion as a holy mandate.
So when they are massacring cities and deporting populations, they aren't just doing it for resources.
No, Ashur commanded them to conquer the world and bring order to chaos. When they subjugated a new territory, they demanded the conquered people acknowledge the supremacy of Ashur. Politics, military conquest, and religion were utterly inseparable. To rebel against the Assyrian king or to withhold tribute was not just treason, it was an act of blasphemy against Ashur himself. Which is exactly why the Assyrians felt morally justified in using such horrific torture against rebels. You weren't just a political dissident, you were a heretic.
And these gods, whether it was Marduk or Ashur or Ishtar, weren't just abstract ideas living up in the clouds. To the Mesopotamians, the gods were literally, physically present in their cities. The sources detail the cultic practices surrounding what they believed were living statues. This completely changes how you view their religion.
It was a deeply literal, physical relationship. The artisans crafted these magnificent cult statues out of precious imported woods. They plated them in gold, dressed them in the finest linens, and used precious stones like lapis lazuli for their eyes. But once the opening of the mouth ritual was performed, they didn't just pray to the statue as a symbol, they believed the divine essence of the god literally descended and resided inside the physical object.
So they treated the statue like a living, breathing, incredibly high-maintenance VIP guest living in the center of their city.
Precisely. The daily rituals were exhausting. The priests would literally wake the statue up in the morning. They would wash it with pure water. They would clothe it in incredibly expensive, jeweled garments that were changed depending on the festival calendar. They would burn incense to provide a pleasing aroma. And most importantly, they fed the statue lavish feasts twice a day.
Wait, how do you feed a wooden statue?
They would lay out massive spreads of prime cuts of meat, fresh bread, fruit, and beer before the statue. They would close the curtains so the god could eat in private. The belief was that the god consumed the spiritual essence of the food. Once the god was finished, the curtains were opened, and the very real, physical leftover food was then consumed by the king and the high priests. It was a massive engine of wealth redistribution.
And the houses built for these living gods were the ziggurats. We always see pictures of these in textbooks, towering, stepped temple platforms that completely dominated the skyline of any Mesopotamian city. I used to think they were tombs, like the Egyptian pyramids.
No, they served a completely different function. A ziggurat was a solid mass of sun-baked mud bricks, faced with fired bricks. It wasn't hollow. There were no burial chambers inside. They were monumental staircases. The Mesopotamians believed the ziggurat was a physical link between heaven and earth, providing a high place for the god to descend from the sky and a place for the priest to ascend to meet them.
The most famous one, of course, was Babylon's main ziggurat, dedicated to Marduk. It was called Etmenenki, which translates to the foundation of heaven and earth. The sources note it was so massive and awe-inspiring that it served as the historical inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel.
Maintaining these monumental ziggurats, providing the daily feasts for the statues, and managing the vast temple estates required an enormous amount of wealth. Over the centuries, the priesthoods that controlled the temples became vast, wealthy, and essentially tax-exempt corporate institutions. They controlled vast tracts of agricultural land and herds of livestock. The high priests wielded almost as much practical power as the king himself.
And the king's power was entirely dependent on maintaining a good relationship with those priests. Which brings me to a specific ritual detailed in the sources that I just can't stop thinking about. The Akitu festival.
The Akitu was the massive 12-day New Year festival in Babylon, held in the spring to celebrate the agricultural renewal and Marduk's victory over chaos. It was the most important event of the year.
During this festival, there is a specific ritual involving the king. The all-powerful king of Babylon, the guy who commands the armies and executes people at will, is brought into the inner sanctum of the temple to stand before the statue of Marduk. The high priest physically strips the king of his royal crown, his scepter, and his weapons. He places them on a stool before the god. Then the high priest makes the king kneel, and he violently slaps the king hard across the face.
And the goal of the slap was to force the king to cry.
Yes. The king has to produce tears to prove his genuine humility to Marduk. While kneeling, the king has to swear an oath that he has not neglected the city of Babylon, he has not neglected the temple, and he has not abused his subjects. Only after this public humiliation does the priest give him back his crown and scepter, effectively renewing his divine mandate to rule for another year.
It is an absolutely stunning piece of political theater.
I try to imagine the modern equivalent. Imagine if today, before a president or a prime minister could take office for another year, they had to be dragged onto national television, publicly stripped of their power, forced to kneel, and violently slapped in the face by a religious leader until they cried. It is a brilliant theatrical check on absolute power. It was the priesthood's way of reminding the king, you may have the armies, but we have the gods. You serve at our pleasure. Do not cross us.
And that tension, that delicate, deeply fragile balance of power between the king in his palace and the priests in their temple, is the very fulcrum upon which the fate of the entire civilization turned. We have seen how crucial this balance was to maintaining stability. Which raises the ultimate question. What happens when a king decides he no longer needs to humble himself? What happens when a king actively ignores the gods and the priests that gave him his power in the first place?
It leads to total, catastrophic collapse. Which brings us to our final act, the fall of Babylon. We are looking at the years between 626 and 539 BC. The terrifying Assyrian Empire has been completely destroyed by the coalition, and Babylon has risen from the ashes to form the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And initially, things are going incredibly well for Babylon.
Better than well. This is the period of Babylon's greatest glory. Under the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar and, much more famously, his son Nebuchadnezzar II, the Neo-Babylonian Empire reaches its absolute zenith of power and wealth. Nebuchadnezzar II rules for over 40 years, from 605 to 562 BC, and he is a builder and a military conqueror on a scale rarely seen in human history. He aggressively expands Babylonian territory all the way across the Levant, pushing right up to the borders of Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea.
I recognize that name. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar who famously besieged and destroyed Jerusalem in 587 BC. He destroyed Solomon's temple and initiated the Jewish Babylonian captivity, an event that profoundly shaped the biblical narrative and world history.
Yes. Nebuchadnezzar extracted immense wealth, tribute, and slave labor from these massive military campaigns across the Levant, and he funneled all of those resources back into his capital. He transformed Babylon into the glittering, undisputed wonder of the ancient world.
The sources describe the sheer scale of his building projects. He builds the magnificent Ishtar Gate, covered in brilliant blue glazed bricks and adorned with golden lions and dragons. He supposedly constructs the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, to cure his wife's homesickness for the mountains. And he finalizes the massive Edamananki ziggurat to Marduk. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was the undisputed center of the global economy and culture. It was untouchable.
Untouchable while he was alive. But just like with Hammurabi 1,000 years earlier, the drop-off in competence after Nebuchadnezzar dies is staggering. The empire declines rapidly. We see a series of assassinations, instability, and short-lived reigns. The royal family is tearing itself apart, and eventually the throne is seized by a man named Nabonidus, who rules from 556 to 539 BC.
Nabonidus is such a bizarre figure. The sources describe him as a deeply eccentric ruler. He was of non-royal origin, essentially a usurper who took the throne in a palace coup. He is often called the first archaeologist because he was obsessed with digging up the foundation pegs of ancient temples to see who built them thousands of years earlier. But as a politician, Nabonidus makes the single most fatal mistake in Mesopotamian history.
He violates the golden rule of Babylonian politics.
Yeah.
He completely alienates the powerful priesthood of Marduk.
Right. As we just established with the Akitu festival, Marduk is the supreme god and his priests are the ultimate kingmakers. But Nabonidus brings his own religious baggage to the throne. He has a deep personal obsession with Sin, the moon god. His mother was a high priestess of Sin in the northern city of Haran. When Nabonidus takes power, he decides he wants to elevate the moon god to the supreme position in the pantheon, effectively trying to demote Marduk.
It was an incredibly dangerous theological game. He pours massive state resources into rebuilding Sin's ruined temple in Haran. Meanwhile, he completely neglects the temples of Marduk and Babylon. He stops funding their upkeep. The priests of Marduk, who control vast wealth and public opinion, are watching the king actively try to replace their god.
And then, as if insulting them wasn't enough, Nabonidus takes it a massive step further. He doesn't just neglect Marduk ideologically, he physically abandons the city of Babylon.
Yes, for reasons that historians still fiercely debate today. Perhaps it was extreme religious devotion to the moon god, perhaps he was trying to secure lucrative Arabian trade routes, or perhaps he was just fleeing the incredibly toxic, hostile political environment he created for himself in the capital. Nabonidus leaves Babylon. He takes a portion of the army and marches deep into the Arabian desert to an oasis town called Taima, and he stays there for 10 years.
He moves to the desert for a decade. I compare Nabonidus to a modern CEO who aggressively alienates his entire powerful board of directors, decides he's sick of the corporate grind and the negative press, moves to a silent meditation retreat in the middle of the desert for a decade, leaves his inexperienced son, a guy named Belshazzar, in charge of the day-to-day operations of the company, and then is absolutely shocked when a rival corporation effortlessly initiates a hostile takeover.
That analogy is painfully accurate. Because the king is physically absent in Taima, the vital machinery of the state grinds to a halt. Crucially, the Akitu New Year festival cannot be held.
Because the ritual absolutely requires the physical presence of the king to be slapped and humbled before Marduk.
Yeah, exactly. For 10 years, the statues of the gods don't parade through the streets. The king's mandate isn't spiritually renewed. The cosmic order is officially broken. The wealthy, powerful priesthood of Marduk is beyond furious. They are apoplectic. They begin circulating propaganda accusing Nabonidus of madness, of gross blasphemy, and of committing deep heresy against the state. The internal division in Babylon is absolute. The elite are completely fractured.
And lurking just over the eastern horizon is that rival corporation, the Persian Achaemenid Empire, led by a brilliant military commander named Cyrus the Great. Cyrus has been rapidly expanding his empire, and he looks at Babylon. He sees this massive, festering internal religious schism, and he knows exactly how to exploit it. In 539 BC, Cyrus launches his invasion.
And this is where we see Cyrus's absolute mastery of public relations and psychological warfare. Cyrus does not march on Babylon acting like a brutal, bloodthirsty foreign conqueror looking to burn the city to the ground like the Hittites or the Assyrians would have done. He weaponizes Babylon's own internal religious crisis against its absentee king.
How does he do that?
Before his army even reaches the massive, impregnable walls of Babylon, Cyrus floods the region with messaging. He initiates a massive propaganda campaign. He declares to the Babylonian people that he is not invading to destroy them. He is coming to liberate them. He claims that Marduk himself, disgusted by the heresy and neglect of Nabonidus, scanned the earth looking for a righteous, pious ruler. And Marduk handpicked Cyrus the Persian to march on the city and restore true worship.
It is brilliant Machiavellian political strategy. He essentially sends a message to the disgruntled priests of Marduk saying, I know your king abandoned you. If you let me in, I will give you your power back. I will fully fund your temples, and I will get rid of this lunatic who stopped your festivals.
And it works flawlessly. Babylon possessed massive, double-thick defensive walls that had held off armies for centuries. But when Cyrus arrives at the gates in 539 BC, there is no epic, prolonged siege. The gates are essentially opened for him by the Babylonian elite.
He walks into the greatest fortress on earth virtually unopposed. Nabonidus, who had finally rushed back from the desert when it was too late, is captured. His son Belshazzar is killed, and the massive Neo-Babylonian Empire is smoothly absorbed into the Persian Empire. The native Mesopotamian self-rule, a continuous, unbroken tradition of kingship stretching back thousands of years to the Sumerians and the builders of Ur, is officially over. The blueprint of civilization has been handed to a new power.
It is a stunning, bloodless end to a violent, dramatic era. The priests traded their independence to get rid of a king they hated.
Okay, let's take a step back and recap this incredible journey. We have just covered 1,400 years of incredibly dense, dramatic human history. We started in the chaotic, burning ashes of the fall of Ur and the despair of the city laments. We watched Hammurabi ruthlessly monopolize the region through deceptive alliances and literally carve his rigid, class-based laws into stone. We saw the Kassites maintain centuries of peace through pure cultural assimilation. We witnessed the terrifying, iron-willed war machine of the Assyrians try to rule the world through forced deportations and psychological fear, only to be burned to the ground by a vengeful coalition. We marveled at the mathematical brilliance of a base 60 system and the dual unified approach to medicine. And finally, we witnessed the bloodless fall of Babylon, brought down by an eccentric king who forgot the ultimate unbreakable rule of Mesopotamian politics. You never, ever cross the priests of Marduk.
It is a sweeping, deeply human saga of ambition, extreme organizational genius, and profound hubris.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to carry with you today. The next time you glance at your watch or the clock on your phone and notice that 60 minutes have passed, or the next time you sign a complex legal contract that requires a witness and a signature, or even the next time you see a modern political leader standing in front of a religious symbol to justify a military campaign or a new law, I want you to remember that you are looking directly at the ancient echoes of Babylon and Assyria. Those structures, those habits, aren't modern inventions. They are the ancient software of civilization that was coded thousands of years ago, still running quietly in the background of our daily lives.
And if we look deeply at that software, it raises a final vital question that we haven't explicitly touched on yet. Throughout this entire journey, reading through all these sources, one theme hums constantly beneath the surface. The Mesopotamians were utterly existentially obsessed with permanence.
What do you mean by that?
They knew better than anyone that they lived in a deeply fragile world. They watched empires rise and fall in a single generation. They knew they could be wiped off the map by the next invader marching down the river. So what did they do to fight that fragility? They etched their laws in black diorite stone, hoping it would last forever. They baked their daily receipts and legal contracts into clay that could literally survive a burning city. They carved horrific, terrifying divine curses into massive stone boundary kuduras, desperately trying to stop future generations from altering their legacy, moving their borders, or forgetting their names. They were driven by a profound terror of being forgotten, of being erased by the chaotic, swirling sands of history.
They wanted to leave a permanent mark that the universe couldn't just delete.
Exactly. And look at us today. Look at our modern society. Are we really any different? We are currently obsessed with digitizing all our data. We are backing up our entire lives, our photos, our literature, our laws, to the cloud. We are building decentralized blockchains and constructing massive, supposedly unhackable digital archives to preserve our culture for the future. We think it makes us highly advanced and uniquely modern. But is it possible we are just building digital kuduras? Are we driven by the exact same ancient existential fear that the Mesopotamians had? The deep, quiet fear that one day the metaphorical Hittites might show up, the power grid might go out, and our entire glorious civilization could be wiped from the history books in a single afternoon.
That is a chilling, brilliant thought to end on, because in the end, whether we were carving it in clay in a desert or coding it in silicon in a server farm, we are all just desperately trying to make sure the server doesn't crash. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.